In this video, we're diving into 10 poor man meals from the Great Depression era. Simple recipes that helped families stretch their budgets and fuel their days. These meals were born out of necessity, but they also show just how creative and resourceful people can be when times are tough. Number 1. Hoover Street. This dish was famously named after President Herbert Hoover, who was often blamed for the hardships of the 1930s, and it appears in numerous periodicals and community cookbooks that chronicled Great Depression recipes. People boiled macaroni, tossed in canned tomatoes, and added sliced hot dogs or any affordable sausage, along with leftover vegetables if they had them. Cookbooks from the 1930s note that sometimes cooks substituted the hot dogs with cheaper cuts of meat, or even skipped it entirely if money was extremely tight. Families who later lived through the 1940s or 1950s might recall a variation that included processed cheese, reflecting how processed foods became more widely available after World War II. By the 1960s and 1970s, baby boomers used Hoover stew as a quick meal when juggling jobs and raising families, occasionally serving it with a side of bread to soak up the tomato sauce. Gen Xers might remember older relatives commenting on how it was once seen as a symbol of thrift and resilience. Today, YouTube channels demonstrating Depression-era recipes sometimes show modern versions that include spices, onions, or bell peppers, proving that a few simple ingredients can still create something comforting and inexpensive. Number 2. Mulligan Stew. This hearty meal was popular among drifters and so-called hobos who rode the rails across old America in search of work, and it's closely associated with tough times in the early 20th century. Various articles point out that Mulligan stew was made by throwing whatever was on hand into a single pot. Potatoes were the most common ingredient, often supplemented with onions, carrots, or canned vegetables. If someone had a small piece of meat, sometimes just scraps, it got tossed into the stew to add flavor. Survivors of the 1930s recalled how neighbors would pool their resources to create a shared meal, a practice that helped maintain a sense of community despite widespread poverty. In the 1940s and 1950s, families continued to rely on Mulligan stew, especially in rural areas, because it could stretch limited ingredients to feed everyone at the table. By the 1960s and 1970s, baby boomers were still cooking variations of Mulligan stew in big aluminum pots for community gatherings, keeping alive the tradition of communal sharing. Modern cooking blogs refer to it as a budget-friendly, slow-cooked meal that can easily be adapted for a crock-pot or pressure cooker. Gen Xers sometimes note that it's a comfort food, reminding them of old stories about grandparents who survived with very little. Number 3. Chipped beef on toast, SOS. Known jokingly by the military nickname SOS, this meal was popular in the Depression era because dried beef was relatively cheap compared to fresh cuts. Recipes from the 1930s instructed home cooks to make a simple white sauce with flour, milk, or even watered-down evaporated milk, and butter or drippings, then toss in chipped or shredded dried beef. The finished product was ladled over toast to create a filling breakfast or lunch. Some older relatives from the 1940s and 1950s liked to mix in peas or onions to stretch the dish further, while baby boomers in the 1960s occasionally swapped chipped beef for canned tuna in a pinch, creating a dish some called tuna in white sauce. Cooks in the 1970s and 1980s might recall seeing it in diners, often served with a side of home fries. In the modern era, you'll find references to it in historical cookbooks and on YouTube channels that showcase nostalgia cooking, linking it to memories of old commercials or black and white photos from an era when every ingredient mattered. People today still talk about how, despite its humble origins, chipped beef on toast has a certain comforting taste that reminds them of simpler times. Number 4. Cabbage and potato hash. During the 1930s, cabbage was prized for its affordability, and potatoes were another staple that lasted a long time in storage. Newspaper articles from that period often stressed that you could feed a family for pennies by sautéing chopped cabbage and diced potatoes together in whatever cooking fat you had on hand. Some families added onions or leftover bacon bits if they were lucky enough to have them. By the 1940s and 1950s, cooks began experimenting with different seasonings like caraway seeds or paprika as flavor influences from various immigrant communities spread across the country. Memories of baby boomers in the 1960s might include a parent standing over a cast iron skillet, frying up cabbage and potatoes for dinner on a busy weeknight. People in the 1970s seeking nostalgia or a quick budget meal sometimes served it with a slice of bread or a side salad. Modern cooking websites often suggest substituting sweet potatoes or adding a handful of shredded cheese for a contemporary twist. But the original spirit of this Depression-era meal remains the same. Transform cheap, sturdy vegetables into a warm, satisfying dish. Gen Xers occasionally mention how they learned this recipe from older neighbors, connecting different generations through shared tastes. Number 5. Vinegar pie. This dessert emerged from the stark reality that fresh fruits were often too costly or simply not available in the 1930s. Home cooks wanted a tangy flavor that mimicked apple or lemon, and they discovered that vinegar could create a similar taste profile when combined with sugar, butter, if available, and a few spices. Old cookbooks from the 20th century talk about how vinegar pie was a clever solution for those longing for something sweet without breaking the bank. By the 1940s, some recipes included a dash of nutmeg or cinnamon to enhance the illusion of real fruit flavor. The baby boomer generation in the 1950s and 1960s often saw older relatives whip up vinegar pie for potlucks or holiday gatherings as a nod to family heritage. By the 1970s, convenience foods overshadowed some of these Depression-era desserts, but nostalgia kept them alive in certain communities. Now, small-town bakeries and online recipe bloggers have revived vinegar pie as a vintage treat. It might not appear in glossy magazines, but it has a loyal following among those who appreciate old Hollywood charm, old commercials, and the broader cultural nostalgia for 20th century America. People are always fascinated by how something so simple can taste so surprisingly good. Number 6. Mock apple pie. This might be the most famous trick dessert from the Depression era, made with crackers, sugar, and spices to replicate the taste of apples. Food historians indicate that the original version dates back even before the 1930s, but it became especially common during hard times when apples were pricey. Although Ritz crackers became a feature of many post-Depression recipes, families earlier on sometimes used saltines or homemade crackers. Magazines from the 1940s and 1950s reveal that housewives frequently served mock apple pie at community events, challenging neighbors to guess what was inside. The baby boomer generation in the 1960s and 1970s might recall brand jingles or old commercials that highlighted this recipe as a marvel of convenience and thrift. Some Gen Xers experienced it at family reunions, discovering only later that there were no apples involved at all. Today, YouTube bakers who focus on historical or retro recipes love demonstrating how to whip up a convincing pie filling just by boiling sugar, water, lemon juice, and crackers. Modern critics are split. Some find it a quirky relic of old America, while others genuinely enjoy its taste. Either way, it remains a testament to Depression-era creativity, showing how far folks would go to replicate beloved flavors despite limited resources. Number 7. Eggless, milkless, butterless cake. Often called Wacky cake. Countless articles discuss this cake as a prime example of Depression-era innovation, when rationing and financial constraints pushed bakers to find alternatives to costly ingredients. The recipe typically includes flour, sugar, cocoa for a chocolate version, baking soda, water, and a small amount of vegetable oil. Early references from the 1930s showed up in community fundraiser booklets, with variations that used coffee or leftover brewed tea instead of plain water to add extra flavor. Families in the 1940s and 1950s continued making it even after the economy improved, simply because it was quick, easy, and unexpectedly moist. Baby boomers might remember it from church socials, often served with a simple frosting made from powdered sugar and water or a spoonful of jam. By the 1960s and 1970s, mainstream magazines sometimes referred to it as a crazy cake, acknowledging how unusual it seemed to bake without eggs or milk. Modern cooking influencers have rediscovered it as a vegan-friendly option, confirming that a Depression-era recipe can find new life in the 21st century. Gen Xers who grew up with grandparents that taught them how to bake may fondly recall the small well you made in the dry mix to add the wet ingredients, which was more than just a fun quirk. It reflected the careful approach to kitchen chemistry that thrifty cooks perfected decades ago. Number 8. Water pie. This curious pie is another prime example of making do with the bare minimum. Historical references indicate it dates back to times of severe ingredient shortages, notably in the 1930s, when families had more water on hand than anything else. The filling is made by pouring water into a pie crust, then sprinkling sugar, flour, and sometimes vanilla extract or bits of butter on top. During the 1940s and 1950s, rural communities might have served water pie at church dinners, intriguing those who had never heard of such a thing. Baby boomers in the 1960s may recall the pie popping up in local newspapers or household hints columns as a way to impress guests without spending too much money. People in the 1970s who embraced nostalgic cooking sometimes tried it out of pure curiosity, wanting to see if a recipe so simple could possibly taste good. Today, you can find water pie on YouTube channels dedicated to vintage recipes, with cooks demonstrating that it forms a surprisingly sweet and custard-like filling. Internet blogs have dissected the technique to figure out how flour and sugar combine in just the right way to thicken water into a dessert. While it might not be the first choice for a modern dinner party, it stands as a testament to how creative and determined people were during economic crises. Number 9. Liver and onions. Though some might argue it's an acquired taste, liver and onions became a go-to for families on a tight budget, especially during the 1930s, because organ meats were far cheaper than prime cuts. Households learned to soak liver in milk or salt water to remove any bitter flavor before cooking. In the 1940s and 1950s, doctors began praising the nutritional value of liver, and many baby boomers grew up hearing about its benefits, even if they weren't fond of the taste. Older relatives from the 1960s might recall seeing black and white commercials or reading pamphlets about how liver could help address vitamin deficiencies. By the 1970s and 1980s, it was less common to see it on mainstream restaurant menus, but thrifty home cooks still turned to liver and onions for a cheap protein source. Modern food blogs often include disclaimers, acknowledging that not everyone loves the unique flavor, but they praise it as a historically significant and nutrient-dense meal. Some fans have developed ways to incorporate bacon or additional spices to make the dish more palatable, reflecting how tastes have evolved, but the frugal mindset remains. Gen Xers, who might remember being served this dish by grandparents, sometimes revisit it for nostalgic reasons, discovering that it's more enjoyable than they recalled. Number 10. Slumgullion. Another stew-like creation, Slumgullion was a catch-all meal that combined ground meat, or any scraps, tomato sauce, onions, and a range of other cheap ingredients like pasta, rice, or beans. References to Slumgullion go back well before the Depression, but it gained popularity in the 1930s because its flexibility matched the era's need to make do with whatever was on hand. Families in the 1940s who were used to rationing continued to make it, adding vegetables from home gardens whenever they could. By the 1950s and 1960s, baby boomers might have encountered Slumgullion as a casual weeknight dinner, often topped with a sprinkle of cheese if finances allowed. The 1970s saw budget-conscious cooks relying on it as a one-pot wonder, especially useful for feeding a household on a single paycheck. Today, online forums and nostalgia-based YouTube channels bring Slumgullion back into the spotlight, reminding viewers that a hearty, adaptable meal can be made from just a few staples. Gen Xers, who grew up watching family members toss together leftover ingredients, learned how versatile this recipe could be. Modern variations might include bell peppers, different herbs, or vegetarian crumbles instead of meat. The spirit, however, remains the same. A simple dish designed to feed everyone around the table, reflecting the collective memory of an era when every scrap of food had to count. These meals have been gathered and analyzed from an extensive range of sources, including historical newspapers, personal blogs devoted to old America, nostalgic YouTube cooking channels that recreate 20th century recipes, and interviews with descendants of those who lived through the Depression. More than 100 such sources offer insights into how necessity drove creativity in the kitchen. People across the United States found inventive ways to keep food on the table, from substituting unconventional ingredients to learning how to flavor simple dishes with whatever was available. Stories from baby boomers and Gen Xers show how these traditions carried into the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, and even the 1980s, ensuring that families never completely forgot the survival strategies of earlier generations. Old Hollywood films, vintage commercials, and classic music from the Golden Age further enrich the sense of nostalgia that surrounds these recipes. They serve as living reminders that frugality, resourcefulness, and a pinch of creativity can transform just a few inexpensive items into something that not only feeds the body, but also ties us to the memories, stories, and resilience of the past.